My name is Annette Duke. I'm an attorney at the Massachusetts Law Reform Institute, and I'm a colleague and friend of David's. Over the last 13 years, David and I joined forces to work on a range of legislative and access to justice issues. My world was at Mass Law Reformer as a law reformer. His world was at Legal Services Center. The Harvard Legal Aid Bureau was in the courtroom, the classrooms, and the front lines in people's homes. One day, right before David testified at the State House, which he did on a number of occasions, but this was for the first time, he said, "Duke," that's what he would call me, Duke. "Do you think I should tell them I'm from Harvard?" That was very strategic. And that was David. David was strategic, he was selfless, he was smart, and he layered all of this with humor and spirituality. I miss David's voice at the table, and I know we all do. That New Jersey fast-talking lawyer who asked questions that made us stop and think. The voice that expressed moral outrage at housing injustice alongside tenants and organizers. The voice you could even hear speaking when he wasn't talking, because David would quietly nod or raise his eyebrow just to signal what he was thinking. You all remember those looks. David also had a great sense of humor. He was very funny. He loved to have a good time in between it all. He loved to talk about his family, basketball, art, words, life, and beyond. I met David a couple of years after he and Stacy had Lev and Shayna, and I had, with Kenny, Ian. Lev and Ian are about 2 weeks apart, so David and I would constantly talk about our kids in between work. The first time I met David was when he was at Legal Services Center in JP, and he came to a meeting. It was actually many meetings when we had to update the pro se eviction answer form. I'm sure there are others in the room that were at that meeting. That's the form that tenants use to tell their story to a judge. But this was my first exposure to David, and his debates were like watching a ping pong match. It was boom, 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 and I had to keep it all together so we could make all the changes. That's the year that the answer grew a little bit longer than it had been. We erred on the side of being thorough and not really accessible. But later, David would advocate that this long answer, as well as others would advocate, needed to be redone. Made perfect sense. We had to do it again. It wasn't good enough. That was David. David joined another working group to make it shorter, so that unrepresented tenants could fill out the form without a lawyer, because the fact is the majority of tenants don't have a lawyer. And that was a fact that David brought home wherever he was. After many meetings with this group and phone debates, our collective created 3 one-pagers. By the way, that long answer was 9 pages. These 3 one-pagers became Form A, Form B, and Form C, and as David joked, little Form Z. And he was alluding to the microscopic little cat Z in Dr. Seuss's Cat in the Hat, which at the time we were both reading to our kids. But I don't think anyone else in the room got the joke. But I will always remember little Form Z, classic Grossman wit. Early on, David learned that I was Jewish. This opened up a whole new avenue for David. A member of the tribe in need of teaching. After one of our meetings, David referenced Tikkun Olam. He spoke about his remarks at the memorial service for Gary, and at that point, I went home and I immediately read David's remarks online. And when I finished, I understood Tikkun Olam, which means trying to fix a broken world like I had never understood it before. I tucked David's remarks in my folder, which I have returned to periodically to get recentered. I still have this folder, and I carry it with me. It has gone from my office to next to my bed. David's words were amazing, as was the life of Gary and their relationship. But there was one particular line that resonated deeply for me as a legal services lawyer. David said, "For Gary, Doing the work of Tikkun Olam and expanding the circle of people involved in the work was the primary goal in setting up LSC program, and remained the primary goal as he refined and developed the program over the years. For David, expanding the circle was also a primary goal in his work, and he achieved it in so many ways, and we are all parts of those circles. I vividly remember seeing him physically circled by students at the State House. They were also engaged, and he was debriefing with them in the hall. David worked to build and collaborated with talented circles of lawyers at the Legal Services Center and the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau, and you are all amazing lawyers and teachers and advocates. He created safe learning circles for students to experience the law, to knock on doors, and to learn from one another. With his City Life Vita Urbana partner, Steve Meacham, through the No One Leaves project, he expanded the circles of people involved fighting foreclosures at a time when thousands were being uprooted from their homes. The No One Leaves projects turned a crisis into a movement that has multiple circles with partners in Boston, across the state, and nationally. Part of David's magic was that he was a great collaborator. That was his leadership style. David also joined many circles that focused on housing policy, and he and I had an opportunity to join forces on those. In 2003, David and I were both asked by the Department of Public Health to be on a committee to review the state sanitary code. The code, as we refer to it, establishes minimum health and safety standards for housing. Our job was to try and make it better. It was also, as always, to make sure it wasn't weakened. While we signed up for the most contentious subcommittees, the issue that David felt most passionate about was indoor air quality. Here were his words to the committee. Everyone now understands that mold and indoor air quality are a serious public health issue in which housing is implicated, and yet there is almost nothing in the code about it. We should consider amending the code to have it set forth specific standards. Input from experts will obviously be essential. And that was David's first step. He then set up a meeting for the two of us to consult with his expert. At the time, Rafael Mares was his partner in crime at the Legal Services Center, and Ethan Mascoop was his frontline inspector. Ethan was the master on the code. David invited me to LSC, but he also decided to have some fun. He asked Rafael and Ethan to each bring a challah from a different bakery and do a blind taste test on me to see which one I liked the best. My first answer was classic Annette. They were both good, but they were. David thought I was being too polite, so he pressed me to pick one. It was all so much fun, thanks to David injecting whimsy. While DPH's code committee went dormant, later David worked with my colleague Judith Liebman to press through various channels that the code require foreclosing lenders to be responsible for repairs from the very first stages of a foreclosure. The code, I have to say, however, has been difficult to reform. But the degree of difficulty was not the measure that David used to take on work. He was a tenacious legal warrior, as we all know. In 2010, David and Judith again teamed up with others to pass a just cause eviction law with protections for tenants in foreclosed properties. At the tail end of the process, right before the bill passed, David and Judith had to rush up to the State House to prevent the passage of a definition of a key word that would have reduced the number of people protected by the law. Their run to the State House with the right language and tenacious advocacy resulted in victory, an expanded definition. The bill passed into law and was a major win, marking one of the strongest laws in the country which protects tenants facing foreclosure. David's fingerprints on that law were large. David also put his oar in for at least 10 or 12 years to fight against the mandatory rent escrow battles, which is probably my middle name at this point. Many of you have put your oar in. These bills would automatically require tenants to pay whatever their landlord claims is due or lose the right to defend themselves before even getting to court. David came to the State House and testified for years and was very well received, despite being from Harvard. In 2007, he reviewed 1,000 cases in the Boston Housing Court. Close to 90% of the 1,000 cases, he told the committee, involved a situation in which the landlord was represented by counsel and the tenant was unrepresented, an imbalance in knowledge, skill, power, and preparation that inevitably leads to inequitable outcomes. This is dangerous and unnecessary. David had an extraordinary talent at weaving together data and outrage. He was good with words, and he was great on his feet. While a fighter, David was also very kind and supportive. He gave me moral strength during heated hearings just by sitting next to me. He gave so many of us moral support. I miss my partner in crime. But each time David came to the State House, he expanded the circle, bringing HLab students, including Tom Ferris, who impressed the committee with new statistics. Over the past couple of years, while he has stayed involved electronically, he passed the escrow baton to HLab attorney Patty Whiting, thank goodness. David was very effective at inspiring and engaging others to take up the fight. In 2008, David took on the updating of the organizing chapter in Legal Tactics, the Tenants Know Your Rights Bible. Many of you know that. I am its editor. This was the perfect chapter for David. He added, for the first time in the book's history, a sample collective bargaining agreement with examples about how tenants were negotiating repairs and affordable rents. By negotiating your own solution, he wrote, you may have more control over what the terms of an agreement are, as opposed to just having a judge control the decision. To underscore his message, he also added in the section about picket lines a chant. 2468, don't evict, negotiate. David had spirit. From people's homes to picket lines, from community meetings to meetings with elected officials, from classrooms to courtrooms, from State House to the Attorney General's office, David was a master at practicing law in multiple forums. He worked on many fronts to move the access to justice dial, including working to create the Lawyer for the Day program, as Martha talked about. He joined Mass Law Reform's Housing Court Working Group to identify reforms needed in court. He put his oar in on the water, submeter, and storage laws. He was a member of the Supreme Judicial Court's Access to Justice Commission Housing Court Working Group, with some of you in the audience, whose report gave birth to the statewide Housing Court campaign, which we hope to win. David was a core founder of the Coalition for Occupied Homes of Foreclosure, or COHIF for short, a long-needed organization that helps residents in foreclosed properties stay in their homes, with the vision of creating a stock of community-controlled housing that would stay affordable for the long term. This is only a small slice of what David did. In 2012, the Massachusetts chapter of the National Lawyers Guild honored David for his work to prevent displacement of tenants and homeowners following foreclosure. David, your work, your circles live on in so many ways, and we miss you. Last December, I sent David a link to an announcement from the Gloucester Temple. I'm from Gloucester. They were going to have a lobster pot menorah. I did not know what to think, but I wanted to know what David was thinking. We all wanted to know what David was thinking. I think it's cool, he said. Nothing wrong with a little syncretism, in my view, he replied. I had to go look up the word syncretism. It means, although I know you all know, the amalgamation of attempted amalgamation of different religions, cultures, or schools of thought. He then added, like a good lawyer, by the way, there is precedent for this. Back in 1883, the muckety-mucks of the Reform Judaism movement had a festive meal prior to the big meeting. Unkosher food was served. It was something of a brouhaha and became known as the Treifa banquet. That was quintessential David. He loved history. He challenged us to know more than we did, like words like syncretism, and he challenged himself in the process. He gave us energy even when he was waning. I last saw David on July 2nd, several days before Stacy alerted us that hospice had been called. We had a tremendous visit. There he sat with his iPad and his peach iced tea. He was weak and tethered to oxygen, but we did what we always did. We talked about work, not too much, and talked a lot about our kids. He said he felt fortunate to spend more time with Stacy and be there when his kids came home from school. He was so positive. We talked about art, we talked about sports, we talked about our son's next steps as they look at colleges. We just talked. We had a ball. But of course, when I left, there was so much I didn't get to tell him about my work, my partner in crime, my fellow strategist. I always sought his advice and counsel at tough moments, like we all did. So I wrote him an email about a recent legislative skirmish. I told him that I had been attacked. He wrote back, "Duke, I have to hear that story. I know you rub a few people the wrong way, as do I. But to get physically attacked? I don't know if I can wait until you come out to get the details of that one." That night, I wrote him the details of what was a verbal skirmish, and that was the last I heard from David. My visit with him will always be a gift. David, I miss your wisdom, your humor, your New Jersey fast talk, and sharing news about our kids. You touched us all in so many ways. There are so many circles that you created, that you were part of, that you helped expand. You were and will always be amazing. Your friend, Duke.